We have a reference to pranayama in the Bhagavad Gita. In describing his action yoga, Krishna teaches to perform actions described in the ancient text that have the purpose of freeing the soul from the bondage of matter. These actions are to be performed as an offering to spirit. Pranayama is listed as being a valid offering to spirit to free the self. Some offer inhalation into exhalation, and others exhalation into inhalation, restraining the path of inhalation and exhalation, intent on pranayama. Pranayama blossoms with the advent of Hatha Yoga around the 10th century. But in the centuries between the Yoga Sutra and the appearance of Hatha Yoga, there were several developments that may have contributed to the development of pranayama, and we must look at them briefly. First, there was the rise of bhakti in Hinduism. Bhakti saw devotion to a personal God as a way to liberation. If we could cultivate devotional love for a God, that God might bless us with freedom. Devotional chanting was a primary bhakti technique. Some bhakti teachers claimed that chanting was a form of pranayama, giving all of the benefits attributed to pranayama. Around the 5th century CE, Tantra arose as a spiritual movement in India. Tantra had many expressions and a few basic premises. One premise is that we don't have a soul that is bound in matter. We are a flow of consciousness that can be constricted or expanded. We could say that when we are needy or afraid, we are very constricted, and when we are very content and open, we are expanded. Tantra wanted to expand consciousness to the point where the individual consciousness merged with the universal consciousness. Tantra evolved many rituals to expand consciousness. These rituals often involve facing fears. When we face a fear and stay open, we sometimes experience a feeling of freedom. Tantric practitioners would often meditate on the cremation grounds or deep in a forest late at night as ways of breaking out of the sphere of experience where the mind feels safe. To have our fears revealed while we remain the witness can bring a lot of freedom to consciousness. In some tantric schools, rituals involving consciously inviting shame and humiliation were used. We still see this today with a small Hindu sect called the Aghoris, who set aside concepts of clean and unclean and live in ways that many observers find repulsive. As Islam spread into India, starting as early as the 7th century, it brought powerful changes to Hinduism. There are scholars who believe the Islamic concept of God led to the rise of bhakti. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Mughals from the west began the conquest of North India, bringing Islamic rulers to the kingdoms there. In some parts of North India, strong conversion tactics were used. In other communities, practitioners of Indian spiritual traditions were taxed or deprived of social or economic opportunities. Hindu rituals shifted from community temples conducted by a priest to the kitchen, where they were practiced by the individual family. Tantric practitioners hid their practices completely, sometimes shifting from actually performing rituals to rituals performed entirely as visualizations. Hatha Yoga emerged as an internal form of Tantra, or as a new modality based on tantric principles. The goal was to expand consciousness by dissolving the mental and physical patterns in energy released from the body through rituals involving postures, deep cleaning exercises, and pranayama. Based on its early text, we know that Hatha Yoga used breathing exercises called pranayama, practiced in seated positions to transcend or dissolve the mind. A variety of breathing techniques were developed with a strong emphasis on breath retention. In breath retention, in Hatha Yoga called kumbhaka, fight or flight energy is produced. If that energy is generated appropriately and witnessed by the observing self, the result is an expansion of consciousness. So in the early Hatha Yoga Pradipika, asanas were secondary and pranayama was foremost. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika describes 15 postures that can be used as seated positions for pranayama or positions for holding breath retention. This text, with its teachings about pranayama, was scrutinized in its day and in the centuries that followed. From the writings of yogis, we know that some followed it precisely and others more loosely. Knowing that some yogis followed it closely, it would be beneficial for us to look at a few passages. The second chapter of the Hatha-yoga-pradipika, the Pranayama chapter, begins with a statement about when pranayama should be practiced and what preparation should be done. After asana practice becomes steady, the yogi observing yama and taking wholesome and measured quantities of food should correctly practice pranayama according to his guru, to his teacher. Now, let's interpret this from the perspective of a school that followed the text strictly. Imagine that, God forbid, I'm a guru or an abbot, and I have an ashram. And a man, Bob, comes to be a student in my ashram. I interview Bob. It sounds like he is sincere, he has a good heart, he really wants to grow, he has a love for the practice. So Bob moves into the ashram. He's given a simple room, simple lodging. He's given a simple task, sweeping the floors, for example. And the ashram does morning practice, practice of yamas and niyamas, chanting, mantra, a variety of practices. Now Bob, say, has been in the ashram for 6 months. Bob's doing great. But when I look closely, I see that Bob misses morning practice maybe 2 mornings a week. Obviously, Bob is not steady in asana practice. Some time goes by. Bob has been in the ashram for 2 years. And I look and I say, Bob has not missed a morning practice in 6 months. Bob is now steady in asana. He can get his body on the mat. He might be half asleep. He may have been up all night talking to someone on the telephone or watching Netflix movies. I don't know. But Bob at least can get his body on the mat every morning. That is a sign of steadiness. But I observe that Bob sometimes blows up and loses his temper. He yells at people when he becomes angry, when he becomes irritated. And this happens not too often. So Bob is not able to observe yama. He can control his body and get it on the mat, but he's unable to control his emotions. Bob has been in the ashram now 7 years. And it's been a long time since Bob has blown up at anyone. Bob seems to be respectful of other people's state of mind, aware of and respectful of the peace around him, and Bob can contain and process his emotions internally. But Wednesday night in this ashram is dessert night, and sometimes I see Bob overeating dessert. So Bob is now steady in asana practice, steady in observing yama, but he's not steady in diet. All of the other disciplines were considered easier than diet. Celibacy. You can say no to sex, it's kind of done. You've made your commitment and now you just keep acting on it. But with food, 3 times a day, Bob has to sit down and feed himself. And when he does, there's opportunity for his emotions to take over, for his restless mind or his mind wanting pleasure, wanting reward to take over, and Bob doesn't eat the best diet. So Bob is not ready for pranayama. And if Bob were given pranayama practices, as they are described in this text, before he is ready, the result would not be appropriate. Bob has now been in the ashram 12 years. He has not missed a morning practice in several years. He is very steady in yama. He is respectful of the space and other people's boundaries, personal boundaries. He also can honor his own personal boundaries and eat healthy, moderate portions for all of his meals. Bob is now ready to practice pranayama. Bob is now ready for the preliminary pranayama. This technique isn't given a formal name in the Hatha-yoga-pradipika. It is simply called the pranayama to purify the nadis. In Sanskrit, nadi shodhana. The yogi, seated in Padmasana, should draw in the prana through the moon nadi, and having retained it according to his capacity, should release it through the sun nadi. The student is instructed to inhale through one nostril and hold to his capacity, and then exhale slowly through the other nostril. The phrase, according to one's capacity, is not clear. More information is required. Again, drawing in the prana through the sun nadi, He should inhale to his capacity and hold the prana in the abdomen. Having systematically and correctly performed kumbhaka, breath retention, he should release it through the moon nadi. This verse tells us to inhale fully, to feel prana or pressure from the breath in the belly. The word correctly tells us that there is one way of practicing that is considered correct. Only it will give the desired results. The word systematic tells us that when we hold the breath, we should be able to repeat the same length of holding on the other side and with each following breath retention. So we are holding the breath as long as we can and repeating the holding with each cycle. If we hold one retention too long, the next will be shorter, and that is what we want to avoid. Through that particular nadi, or nostril, which prana is released, draw in the prana again, retaining it with much effort. He should slowly release the prana using the other nostril. He should not release forcefully or quickly. If we hold too long, our exhalation will be too fast. We are to hold as long as we can and repeat the holding on alternating sides and not hold so long that we have to exhale quickly. If one draws in the prana through the moon nadi, one should release the restrained prana through the sun nadi. If the prana was drawn in by means of the sun nadi, after the holding, the prana should be released by means of the moon nadi. As a result of the regular practice of this process, the mass of many nadis becomes unified within 3 months. The text prescribes repeating this cycle 80 times, or 40 rounds, and doing it 4 times a day for 3 months. In the morning, at noon, in the evening, and at midnight, one should offer the practice of kumbhaka, breath retention, gradually building up to 80 breaths. In this way, the student experiences little bursts of fight or flight energy and learns to witness them. Whatever fight or flight energy is witnessed is said to be converted into something called yoga agni, or yoga fire, which expands consciousness. This instruction may feel foreign to modern students. It may even seem like a violation of yoga principles, a distortion of the self. To understand how its practice fits into the realm of yoga, we need to look at a little bit of yoga history and philosophy. The origin of yogic thought is in the Vedas, where students attune to nature gods and forces through fire rituals. The gods were believed to bless the practitioners with wealth. With this wealth, the practitioners performed bigger rituals, and the gods gave bigger blessings in an upward cycle of abundance. With the composition of the Upanishads and the rise of Buddhism and Jainism, a new approach was explored. In this approach, Maya, or illusion, was thought to trap the soul. The soul needed to be freed from Maya by austerity. Any practice that negated desire and fear was considered appropriate to reduce the binding of Maya. Over time, these two approaches were melded into a 2-tier progression. The students started by separating the soul, body, and mind from the society. This was done by choosing the health and well-being of the body and mind over societal norms. Students were taught to eat healthy foods even on holidays when the society might condone eating more exciting and less healthy foods. When one was well established in this phase, they would graduate to the next level, where one chose the soul over the body and the mind. Practices were done which negated the body-mind with the intention of leaving them behind. The first level of practice was called a privritti dharma, working with actions. And the second stage was called nivritti dharma, working beyond actions. Modern Western students rarely see a practitioner of nivritti dharma, so it may seem very foreign. The best example I can give to distinguish between these two stages is Indian dietary purity. Pravritti dharma, dietary purity, would be to eat only pure, healthy foods. Nivritti dharma, dietary purity, would mean to only eat whatever is placed in the bagging bowl. In other words, to let God decide what we eat. Nivritti Dharma practice may not have a place in our modern yoga culture, but the Yoga Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Hatha Yoga Pradipika were composed for Nivritti Dharma practitioners. Not recognizing this may severely limit our understanding and impede our study of these texts. Such an extensive practice of Nadi Shodhana was to have strong effects on the student. One effect is the awakening of Kundalini. Kundalini is not well explained in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, but is said to be the substratum of our being, where we are not inhibited by right or wrong and not separate from the rest of the universe. Kundalini is a state of consciousness where there are not desires and fears from the ego mind, but universal forces moving through us that pull us into actions that merge us with the rest of creation. If these forces can be observed, they become Kundalini. If through attachment or fear we cannot observe them and we are pulled to act, they become destructive. Yogis wanted to grow to become able to witness Kundalini by increasing their capacity to observe ever more powerful forces moving through their body and mind. The next verses from the Hatha Pradipika elaborate on this process, so we will look at them now. In the lowest pranayama, sweating appears. In the intermediate pranayama, there is a shudder. In the highest pranayama, there is the attainment of supreme steadiness. Therefore, the prana should be correctly restrained. Here, 3 progressive stages of practice are described briefly. My personal experience of the first stage was that the pranayama practice generated heat. I would cover my pillow with a towel and sit on it to practice. After 40 rounds of Nadi Shodhana, my clothes and the towel would be soaked with sweat. My teachers informed me that the prana strengthened by the practice was trying to push through blocked nadis, producing heat. Without some understanding of what is happening from a trusted source, most students would not continue practicing beyond this stage. After a few months of this level of practice, I gradually moved into the next level. I would inhale and become so absorbed that I would forget to breathe. Suddenly, I would feel a shudder go through my body that reminded me to exhale. I would often think that I'd held too long and that the next breath would be much shorter. But always I would inhale again and become so absorbed that I would forget that I was holding my breath. The shudder would come to remind me. The third stage of Nadi Shodhana is a mystery. The texts speak of a stage of breath retention called Kevala Kumbhaka. This translates as only holding. And the text specifies that it means only holding without breathing in or breathing out. As long as Kevala Kumbhaka has not been accomplished, the duration of the Sahita Kumbhaka, the individual little Kumbhakas, should be practiced to extend it. The easy and comfortable suspension of the prana without releasing out or drawing in is called Kevala Kumbhaka. Many Indian authors have described a process whereby the students hold their breath for as long as they can while practicing Nadi Shodhana. The holding times are said to increase until the breath can be held for hours. This explanation does not fit my experience or my modern understanding of the body and the mind's need for oxygen. My personal belief is that students entering this third stage will go into deep meditation while practicing breath retention. In their holding, they would forget and start to breathe. The breath would be very shallow and slow because they were in a deep meditative state. Suddenly they would remember that they were practicing pranayama, and they might believe that they'd held their breath for a long time. This could happen more easily in an era when sundials were used to measure the passage of time and where someone always practiced alone. In the early stages of practice, food mixed with milk and ghee is prescribed. But when practice has advanced, such restrictions need not be observed. A student practicing Nadi Shodhana in this way would very likely find themselves constipated after only a few days of practice. This was explained to me by my teachers as the body and mind resisting the increasing prana and holding on in any way that they could. Adding a little oil, milk, or ghee to the diet alleviates the constipation. And either way, the constipation will pass in a short period of time if the student continues to practice. Just as lions, elephants, and tigers are gradually brought under control, similarly prana, when well restrained and regulated, is gradually mastered. The students are warned that the rising prana may be threatening to the ego. The prana, becoming kundalini, stirs up old drives, old emotions, and possibly old traumas, all to be witnessed from buddhi. And the reference to training animals has significance. Lions represent anger, elephants represent fear, and tigers represented lust or sexual energy. These are considered the most binding forces that hold the soul in Maya: anger, fear, and lust. When they take over, they have the power to lower human beings so that they behave like animals. When witnessed in their fullest expression, they have the power to show us that we are not what we think we are. In digesting what prana and kundalini tell us about ourselves, we move closer to perceiving our whole self. After this extended practice time, the students were taught 4 pranayama techniques, all designed to generate more of this fire to be witnessed. These fire-generating techniques described in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika are Bhastrika, Surya Vedana, Murja, and Plavini. Does it make sense that a pranayama such as Bhastrika would have different effects in a student who had undergone the preparation and the 3 months of Nadi Shodhana practice compared to a student who simply learned them in a class without preparation? After practicing these fire-generating techniques for an extended period of time, the student then learned pranayama techniques that channeled the fire to dissolve individual consciousness into universal consciousness. The consciousness-expanding pranayamas taught by the Hatha Yoga Pradipika are Ujjayi, Sitkari, Shetali, and Bhaumari. From this base of 8 pranayama techniques practiced in 15 postures, Hatha Yoga grew to include many more pranayama techniques and many more asanas, as well as techniques to support and refine the whole process. My teacher, Swami Kripalu, was once asked how many pranayamas there were, and his answer was 400 to 600. Most were variations on the original group of 8. When Europeans came to and eventually dominated India, there was a decline through that process in Hatha Yoga. In the late 1800s, with the rising of the independence movement in India, there was a revival of the old culture, and with that a revival of Hatha Yoga. It was considered patriotic to practice yoga in this time, and the best way to introduce it into the society was thought to be through the schools. Pranayama techniques that activated yoga fire were not considered appropriate for this audience, so they were mostly left out. A yoga culture emerged very focused on the physical, with pranayama limited to techniques that calmed the mind, very much as the Yoga Sutra had recommended over a millennium before. In the tradition that I practiced, most of our understanding of pranayama came from Swami Kripalu, who was a traditional hatha yogi. His teachings and practice were not filtered through the Indian school system and contained a high level of yoga fire activation and consciousness expansion that would not be considered appropriate or even understood by most practitioners today. When teaching pranayama to teachers, I tell them that a little practice of most of the pranayamas will have a calming effect on the mind, and this is useful. However, if the pranayamas were practiced in the sequence and amount recommended in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, they would probably observe that if they were happy when they practiced pranayama, the pranayama would make them happier. If they were sad, it would make them more sad. And if they were angry, it would make them more angry. A prominent effect of classical pranayama practice was to magnify the emotions. This would only be positive if someone was prepared for it and willing to accept it. This could lead to the experience that we are not the rational creature we try to be. Seeing what we really are feeling and accepting it can lead to an expansion of our identity. We would see that we are not what we thought we were and have the opportunity to accept the fullness of our experience. A process of preparation was considered necessary for the students to have the effects of pranayama practice, as described in the Hatha Pradipika, be digestible. There has never been a yoga pope. Yoga evolved as independent schools, little silos where students studied with a teacher and learned that particular teacher's approach to the philosophy and the techniques. Different schools would be influenced by a different combination of text. One school may use the Yoga Sutra, but not the Bhagavad Gita. One may use the Hatha Pradipika and one or more Upanishads. In studying the descriptions of asanas and pranayama techniques described in these texts, teachers might interpret them, drawing upon one of these philosophies, informed by their personal experience, and then make assumptions about how the practices should be done. These assumptions were practiced, and if they were perceived to work, they would be passed on to the students through the generations. Throughout history, there has been a teaching in yoga that the Guru's word is gospel. Students did not challenge it and sometimes prided themselves on their ability to embrace their school's approach wholeheartedly. It was probably very easy to be a practitioner when information was fed to the students from one source and accepted and practiced with faith. In modern times, many schools and teachers have gone public, presenting their teachings and practices on the internet and through books. These teachers may speak with confidence and faith in their approach, and students may accept a teacher and an approach and then be surprised when they encounter other teachers with very different approaches. When working with asanas, a teacher may say that a particular alignment is the correct way. This alignment approach may be validated by a modern anatomical understanding of how the joints and muscles work. It is much harder to validate a way of practicing pranayama without an understanding of the intended results and a knowledge of how those results fit into a philosophy. This has led to many students focusing on the basics, those practices and understandings which they experience to be positive and not in conflict with whatever worldview they hold. It has led to folks shying away from the deeper practices where there might be conflicting messages from the teachers and sources of information. This has led to many students focusing on the basic pranayamas, those practices and understandings which they find to be experientially positive and not in conflict with whatever worldview they hold. It has led to folks shying away from the deeper pranayama practices, where there might be conflicting messages from the teachers and from other sources. When one teacher says to do Bhastrika one way, for example, and another teacher describes Bhastrika completely differently, it is easy for the student to step away, avoiding the practice and the conflict. When one teacher says that Tantra Yoga is a non-dual system, which it was in the 9th and 10th centuries, and another teacher says that Tantra is strongly dualistic, seeing the god and goddess everywhere, which it did in the 6th and 7th century, it is very easy for students to feel confused and to just avoid the whole issue. I believe that for yoga teachers, those practitioners who are carrying yoga into the future by passing it on to others, an understanding of the philosophy beyond sectarianism is essential. Then we can understand that Bhastrika Pranayama could be practiced several different ways, all leading to the same result. And that Tantra evolved from dual to non-dual, and a student could practice under either philosophy. Then we have the power to both adapt techniques and philosophy to serve individual students, and to pass on the whole topic to the generations of practitioners that will follow. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. I hope it has added new information to your understanding and inspired you to think deeply, and develop insights that you can explore through practice. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you every success in your practice of pranayama. Jai Bhagwan.